Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today on this webinar. We're just going to wait another minute so a few more people can join, but do stick with us. Thank you. Hi, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome to the third webinar in the 2019 Climate Tracking and Transparency webinar series. My name is Joe Thwaites. I'll be your host on today's webinar. I'm based in the Sustainable Finance Centre here at WRI. And I'm joined today by three excellent panelists who will share their in-depth knowledge and insight on transparency on climate finance within the Paris Agreement rulebook, which was agreed last year at the COP24 negotiations in Katowice, Poland. This webinar series is organised by World Resources Institute's Tracking and Strengthening Climate Action Initiative, or TASCA, together with the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement, known as PATPA. And in order to share existing knowledge and best practice related to improving domestic transparency systems. On today's webinar, first I'll provide some basic instructions for participation. I'll provide a brief overview of the TASCA project and the PATPA initiative, and then we'll get into our presentations. And then the presentations will be followed by a question and answer session where attendees will be able to submit questions directly to the panelists, and we'll have them respond. So during this webinar, attendees will, so this is the overview of what we'll be covering today. And during this webinar, attendees will remain in listen-only mode. Participants may raise comments or questions throughout the webinar by typing them into the questions box, which you can access at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. And if you're having trouble with audio or video, please send an email to Pauline Hill, and please limit your use of the questions function to the topical questions for panelists. And today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available online. So just to run you through the introduction, then we're going to cover the three pillars of finance transparency under the Paris Agreement. That is ex-post reporting on finance provided and mobilized, reporting on finance needed and received, and then ex-ante communications on finance to be provided and mobilized. And then, as I said, we'll have questions and answers. So just a bit of background. The TASCA project is managed by WRI and aims to support governments to be able to transparently communicate progress towards their NDCs, to meet international accounting and reporting requirements, to account for their commitments, and to identify additional abatement opportunities to support national dialogue on future commitments. And we currently work in 5 countries: Colombia, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, and South Africa. Specific activities depend on each country, but the lessons learned and resources developed are shared globally. In addition to our work in country, TASCA actively supports enhancing international transparency, and that includes by providing timely research and analysis to support the negotiations and convene dialogues and discussions with country parties to consider different options. And TASCA is also developing new tools and data platforms to support analysis for decision-making and tracking of implementation. And then the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement was launched in 2010 at the Petersburg Climate Dialogue by South Africa, the Republic of Korea, and Germany. And PATPA, as it's known, promotes ambitious climate action through practical exchange on enhanced transparency to support the achievement of the global temperature goal. PATPA also supports its mission through policy dialogues, convenings to build capacity and encourage peer exchange, and it develops research products to disseminate knowledge. But without further ado, I want to introduce today's panelists. And I'm really excited because all three are negotiators within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they bring really unique insights on what was agreed at COP24 on finance and why. So first up will be Vicky Nouwens, who's a policy advisor in the Flemish Department of Environment and Spatial Development, and she negotiates finance issues for Belgium in the climate negotiations. She'll be speaking on ex-post reporting of finance provided and mobilized. This is covered under Article 9.7 and also under Article 13.9 of the Paris Agreement. And she actually spoke for the European Union on this area. Then there will be Lorena Gonzalez, who is a means of implementation advisor with the support unit for the Independent Association of Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a negotiating group within the UN climate process, known probably better to many of you as ILAC. And she'll speak on developing country reporting on finance needed and received, which is covered by Article 13.10 of the Paris Agreement. Lorena was formerly a negotiator for Mexico in the run-up to and during COP21 when the Paris Agreement was achieved. And also ILAC countries have really taken a leadership role in being early reporters of the finance that they've received and also their further needs. And then last but not least will be Rob Moore, who is the head of climate finance negotiations with the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And he will speak on ex-ante communications on projected finance resources. And this is covered under Article 9.5 in the Paris Agreement. And like Vicky, he spoke for the European Union on this topic in the negotiations. So I think really fantastic lineup. Some of the most insider insights that you'll be able to get on the rulebook on finance issues. So we'll head straight into it, and Vicky's up first. So please take it away.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. I will jump right at it by saying that my goal is by presenting where the new modalities are an improvement to the current system, which was still dated back from the Cancun conference. I'll explain what has actually been agreed on the so-called ex-post finance modalities at the Katowice Climate Summit. For the more geeks among us, those modalities can actually be found in the annex of a CMA decision on Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, more specifically Section 5, subchapters A and B and C, if you really want to have a go to it. Next slide, please. So first of all, the modalities have actually led to more clarity in comparison to the current transparency framework. This is mainly reflected in the substantial list of descriptions that parties are required to provide on their use of assumptions, definitions, and methodologies. Now parties actually have to describe over more than 20 different parameters which they use for the reporting system. And this information will give the necessary background to know what is reported in the tables. And in the current system, we don't have this much details already described. A second example is actually that parties are also now requested to report on efforts taken to avoid double counting. This tackles the current concern that overestimations are happening, especially among parties' reports, because we are speaking of individual reports, but sometimes the same information could be reported among different parties. So now parties have to report on efforts on avoiding double counting among the multiple parties in the provision of public support and also in the mobilization of private finance. And it also relates to double counting related to the attribution between multiple recipient countries. So that's also much more clear now, and we'll see how that will develop and give us more information. Other examples are actually the description on how parties identify the support as being climate specific. This is actually already in the current system, but now I think it has been moved up a bit more and giving more substance to it. And especially for the multilateral finance, they need to explain how the climate specific share was calculated. Another provision is that they need to provide definitions of public and private finance. This was a main concern to ensure that you can't count private finance as public finance and so on. So this now giving a definition makes clear how you see both terminologies as a distinct, especially where entities or funds are mixed. And finally, and this is actually one of my favorite provisions, parties are also requested to provide information on efforts taken to enhance comparability and accuracy of information on financial support provided and mobilized through public interventions, including through the use of international standards or harmonization with other countries. Now, the reason why this is one of my favorites is because it will allow for a gradual enhancement of comparability and accuracy of this information, while also taking into account best practices and the existence of international standards. So it could be a very important provision for further improvement over time of the whole system. Okay, so next slide. So besides these more clarity, we also have more granularity by including several new elements in the modalities, which will provide more details compared to the Cancun Transparency Framework. First of all, as you might know, there is a wide variety of instruments and sources that can deliver climate finance, and now parties are requested to give information on how they see these instruments, but also include how a party has determined this finance to be concessional and/or ODA, including by using information such as grant equivalency, institution and/or instrument-based approaches. For those, I mean, this is an important step towards getting more detailed information about the face value versus grant equivalent value. Of course, this is at this point still on a voluntary basis, but it is definitely a new element in there. Another important element would be the recipient information, where now there is a clear distinction made between the geographic information, so to which country or to which region have you provided the support, and on the other hand, the thematic information, which would be the project to program activity. Now, this is more stipulated on the bilateral support, less on multilateral support, where this information is, of course, also more difficult to provide by each and every recipient. Other elements that are definitely worth mentioning is, for instance, a subsector. Now, besides the sectoral information, we will have to give information on the subsector. This will make clear, for instance, this will make clear if an energy project is actually about renewable energy program, or if it's more related to a clean coal plant or those kind of supports. Another element is the information provided reflects a progression from previous levels in the provision and mobilization of finance under the Paris Agreement. I definitely wanted to include this in my presentation, but we will see how this will be discussed later on, because this was actually one of the final points that came into the negotiation point of at Katowice. But it's definitely also a new element and will give us more granularity. And then also important compared to where on the multilateral side then is that now we also have to make clear that if you report on multilateral finance, if this is on the party's inflow contribution or on the party share in the outflow of the multilateral institution, this will also again for the data analysis be a crucial part of information, because it will make clear if we speak about inflows or outflows and how this will relate to one another. So next slide, please. So we already had clarity, granularity, but it's also more about actuality. I mean, the current modalities actually take into account the reality of the post-2020 world. First of all, their parties are requested to report how the support provided and mobilized is in line with the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. So there is a link towards the 2 degrees goal, towards increasing ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change, and also towards making financial flows consistent with the pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So all those elements are now, I mean, that's the future that we should aim for. So it's good that we have this included in there. Another example is that we have now also other parties than developed country parties are encouraged to use these modalities. Very clearly, this is not an obligation, but it also shows that we go beyond just developed countries' reports that play a role. And finally, there is also clear distinct interlinkages between the finance, the capacity building, and technology development and transfer objectives are much more intertwined. So I hope that this will also be an issue that we will be able to capture in the tables to be developed in 2019. So the next slide. Does this now mean that everything is fine and everything is solved? Of course not. I mean, we are in the UNFCCC negotiations. So there are certainly still some risks or vulnerabilities that require some vigilance to avoid drawing the wrong conclusions or incorrect data use. So, I mean, first of all, as you might have heard, I've always said parties are requested to describe or to define. So it is basically a very much bottom-up approach. It is up to the party to still use their own approach on how to report on the support provided and mobilized. But now the system at least requires them to clearly explain what their approach is. This means the downsides of this is that for the comparison of the data there is a need to have a look at all this information written down to see if actually the numbers can be added, yes or no. So this comparison will be a crucial step. Also, and there are a lot of, I call them conditionalities on reporting. I mean, if the text speaks about providing this information to the extent possible, as applicable, as available on a voluntary basis. So even if these conditionalities were very crucial to build up a system that would be applicable to all, knowing that each party has a different approach, or even to deal with some of the more political issues, it also leaves some room for interpretation and perhaps leaves the door a bit open for a more light-based approach to the new elements. So there I hope that parties are really engaged in getting the most out of it to the extent possible, should be really to the extent possible. So, but that could be another risk that we should take into account later on. As a third example, I've included the reporting burden, which is basically, I mean, it's being overlooked often, but as climate finance data is requested under a lot of different systems and fora, only by ensuring an easy insertion of data, the usefulness of this information will actually surpass the burden to deliver the information. This is another issue that we will need to take into account in our next steps. So in the following months, and especially at the next UNFCCC session, we will also see how parties will interpret the modalities. I mean, we still, I think many of us were still digesting them in the first months of 2019. And we need to see if we still share the same understanding for all those elements. So a crucial next step in this is having this development of the tabular formats, which will kick off at the next June session. And we should ensure that we are, at one hand, allow for flexibility of the bottom-up approach, and also ensure that we do have enough for further improvement over time. So the flexibility is required. And I hope, at least from my point of view, that will actually still be on the basis of a very open exchange of views between parties to focus on understanding each other's views, as we had done in Katowice. So that's basically my thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. And now Lorena is going to talk on reporting on finance needed and received.
Thank you, Joe. And first of all, I would like to thank WRI for the invitation to take part in this webinar series. As you've mentioned, I'm going to be addressing the issue of reporting finance received and needed, which is also part of the enhanced transparency framework as mandated in Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, and more specifically, as is on the screen, referring to Article 13, paragraph 10. I will refer very briefly to three aspects of it. So the first one will be to address some general notions which have been relevant since the Cancun agreements and for the Cancun Transparency Framework, and have been part of the ongoing negotiations related to the transparency system under the UNFCCC. Second, I will briefly touch upon some of the characteristics, elements of the current reporting of finance received and needed, both in the national communications and also in the biennial update reports, or the BURs, which are the two reporting vehicles used by developing countries to communicate this information under the UNFCCC. And third, I will get into the specifics of the Katowice outcome as contained in the decision adopted by the CMA that Vicky just mentioned before, referring to the modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the transparency framework for action and support. In doing this short recap, I'll try to use some examples from the Latin American region that I know firsthand and that Joe also mentioned in his introduction. And I also believe that these examples are relevant for the conversation that we're having today. So getting into it, some of these general notions that have been around for almost a decade in the context of the negotiations under the UNFCCC. No, can we go back? Yes, that's the one, thank you. So, no, can we go one slide behind? So it's the general notions. Yes, that's it, thank you. So in terms of these notions that have been around for a while, it is important to start this conversation by highlighting the flexibility embedded in the transparency system under the UNFCCC for developing countries. The reporting on both finance received and needed has been done on a voluntary basis through a wide range of options to do so for developing countries. Another very important notion is that although most of the time we address these two elements together in the context of the negotiations, the nature of reporting finance received is very different than the one of the finance needed. So the first one, of course, as most of you know, or all of you know, is retrospective, and the latter is prospective. Therefore, the methods to collect and process the data and or to make the estimates are very different as well. There have been many approaches followed by developing countries on how to report this in the past years, throughout the past years. The approach, of course, of trial and error has been present in this context, and many relevant lessons have been learned already. So we have to bear this in mind for the current context and for the current conversation. So in terms of what has been the main focus, at least in the Latin American region, there have been several experiences or approaches from developing countries in designing and trying to establish and implement tracking systems for the financial resources received, aiming at standardizing some of these collection systems and in trying to share some of the experiences and lessons learned in processing this information. One common element to many of these exercises that have been happening in the Latin American region is that countries come up with very different figures in terms of what they can collect versus, for example, the information reported by donors or other stakeholders in the same context. So this has been a recurrent concern in the process. So trying to standardize and trying to come up with a very way to implement the systems. When it comes to the identification and translation of needs in developing countries, the different approaches that have been tried are even more diverse and have changed more significantly over time. And this has to do also with the different instruments that have been used in terms of planning and also in terms of the engagement of the developing countries with the UNFCCC system and the negotiating that has happened for the past 5 to 6 years. Next slide, please, now. So how is the current reporting done? After Cancun, parties devoted a couple of years negotiating the guidelines for the current system. In doing so, some progress has been made, of course, but the guidelines for the voluntary reporting for developing countries on finance received and needed continue to be very general and in some respects inconsistent between the guidelines provided for the national communications and for the biennial update reports. So it would very much be different to how developing countries implemented these regarding its own domestic systems and also determined by how they prioritize their reporting. Some of the countries in Latin America have presented already 2 biennial update reports, but there are some that have not been able to even present the first one. So this is something else to bear in mind in terms of the capacity and the experience in implementing these guidelines. So because of this situation of the general requirements and the very broad guidelines that we have under the UNFCCC, in most of the cases, developing countries have presented partial information with significant variations over time. There has been a constant lack of clarity on how the reporting figures were calculated or derived. And usually there is insufficient level of detail in terms of this information that has been presented. So for example, within the ILAC countries, some have focused more specifically in reporting the support received through the Global Environment Facility for preparing the reports, so the national communications, the biennial update reports, while some others have devoted very significant amount of time and resources, both human and financial, to set processes to collect, analyze, and report very specific information regarding the programs, the projects at a very granular level to the UNFCCC. And this has, of course, been perfected over time. In the case of the finance needed, we also have some sorts of examples within the ILAC countries in terms of the different approaches that they've been following to quantify the needs that they've already identified. And in doing so, some of them have approached this process in terms of the entirety of the portfolio that they're planning to implement within the context of their climate initiatives. Some others focus more specifically on needs identified in relation to the institutional arrangements that they have. So for example, if there is a department or an agency that has specific responsibilities in terms of implementing the climate actions domestically, sometimes they refer the needs of that department or agency as part of the needs in financial quantums to the UNFCCC. So as you can see in the current reporting system, the voluntary reporting done by developing countries has taken very wide and very broad approaches, of course, taking us to very different results in terms of what has been presented so far. Next slide, please. So after 2 years of negotiating under the ad hoc working group for the Paris Agreement and the APA as we all know it, we adopted the Katowice Climate Package, also known or referred to several times as the Paris Rulebook. In the decision adopted by the CMA, which is the conference of the parties serving as a meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, there are new modalities, procedures, and guidelines that refer to support and the specific section, as Vicky also mentioned in her presentation, the specific section in the annex of this decision adopted by the CMA is the Annex 6. So you can go back and take a look at the specific details contained in Annex 6, which refers specifically to the MPGs for finance needed and received. As mandated by the Paris Agreement, it is also relevant to make this caveat in this point of the presentation. These are should provisions, which therefore means that they're voluntary for developing countries. So the reporting will continue to be done on a voluntary basis and taking into account the different capacities and the diversity of circumstances across developing countries. The decision adopted at COP24 has common elements for both support received and needed, which refer to the national circumstances, the institutional arrangements, and the country-driven strategies, as well as the underlying assumptions, definitions, and methodologies used by developing countries to calculate and to derive the figures that will be reported. Some things are new in this context. So after the Katowice package, we will have an enhanced transparency framework to report on. And in the guidelines for developing countries, we also can see many of the characteristics that Vicky mentioned and described in her presentation. So we're aiming to have more specific guidance in terms of what developing countries are expected to present. We expect to get more clarity in terms of the information of the figures that are being presented, because now developing countries will have the opportunity to also systematize more of the categories of information that they will be reporting. And this is also very relevant in terms of the comparability that we can have over time in this new reporting framework. So something that is like it's one of the new elements, and it's one of the most relevant one, is precisely the option for developing countries to present this information on support needed and received in a common tabular format. This is one of the mandates that will have to be negotiated throughout this year in the aim of presenting a recommendation for the CMA. So in broad terms, and without getting too much into details because we don't have that much time left, the MPGs adopted at COP24, I believe, take us a step forward while providing more concise and specific guidelines for developing countries. For example, having a specific guidelines in reference or in relation with Article 9, with Articles 10 and 11, of course, of the Paris Agreement as well, in those elements related to technology transfer and development, and also capacity building. And also, in addition, this new category of information, which relates directly to the support needed and received by developing countries in terms of what Article 13, the whole transparency system for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, requires. So just on a final note, of course, there are many challenges that developing countries will face in transitioning from the current reporting arrangements, precisely because all of the different entry levels and the different and varied experiences that they've had in implementing the current transparency framework, and in transitioning towards these new MPGs for the enhanced transparency framework for the Paris Agreement. Nonetheless, I truly believe that there are as many opportunities to transform the common narrative in the context of the UNFCCC and understand the value of undertaking the necessary steps towards an improved transparency system in which developing countries can also contribute and provide very relevant information to aim at a fuller view of the climate finance landscape, and of course in that common aim as set forth in Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. So I will leave it at that for the time being, but very happy to answer any questions that the participants might have. Thank you, Joe.
Great, thank you so much, Lorena. Now Rob is going to talk on the communications on protected financial resources.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to the other speakers. Just to say, my mic has cut off, or my connection's cut off once or twice, so if it happens, I apologize. I'll get back as soon as I can. So if we could just go straight to the first slide. Reporting on projected levels of future finance was in a provision of the Paris Agreement under Article 9.5. And it came with a couple of caveats around the importance of information being available, provision being applicable to that availability. And that's due to a couple of political sensitivities related to the information. But coming into Katowice, I think it's fair to say it was expected to be one of the more heated negotiations, and that's because of this tension between the importance of predictable finance for many developing countries, which is entirely understandable. In general, aid predictability is a good thing, and we completely agree with that. But this sort of hit up against a couple of limitations to what countries providing finance felt that we could provide in advance for a number of reasons. Some of those are sort of technical, and that's sort of related to at what stage in designing a program that you're going to deliver, is it okay to actually communicate information around that, because it often changes quite late in the day. Or it's related to countries' budgeting processes and sort of when countries know how much climate finance they're going to have. And there are also some political sensitivities in that, even though information is indicative, we feel that once we provide information, there's a high expectation that that is delivered, no matter what qualifiers you put around it. And there's also a tension between providing predictable finance and responsive finance, and that's because we think it's quite important, and a lot of our developing country partners agree, that climate finance should be country driven, should be responsive to country needs, and it's quite hard to do that if you're providing detailed information in advance on precisely what projects, programs, countries you're going to be working in. It's often just not the best practice for actually getting responsive, reactive finance. So that left us in a bit of a predicament where we needed to find a system that was sort of robust and an improvement on what came before. And what was before was the strategies and approaches framework, which we've had in place since 2014, where every 2 years we essentially put in a submission to the UNFCCC, responding to 5 categories of information on future finance. But we're still flexible enough to accommodate very differing national systems, relating to how countries program, relating to how their budget cycles work. Some countries have 1-year cycles with very tight oversight by different bodies, whether they're parliamentary or congressional, and also to programming cycles. So some countries will program out for a couple of years. We do that in the UK. Others will do so more responsively year by year, or even throughout the year. And there was also a need to get the right balance between quantitative and qualitative information. And that's because often in advance, quantitative information is just very limited, especially at the program level. And a lot of parties had set out the importance of qualitative information. A lot of developing country parties had set out the importance of qualitative information for them as something that was, often actually more helpful than just a number. It's better to know a country is looking to work in country X in sector Y than it is to know they're going to provide X 100 million or X billion in overall climate finance. And then there was also more of a sort of negotiations focused issue on sort of sticking within the balance that was struck under the Paris Agreement, which was of differing importance to lots of different countries, and something that we saw right across the rulebook discussions. Paris was, there were key omissions that were present in other decisions that were absent from the 9.5 decision. Some of those were sort of not intentional, like, providing clarity on where these submissions with all of this information goes and where it's stored. Some of them relating to how much it was actually considered and scrutinized were in some parts intentional. And so it was, how do you sort of address the requests of a lot of developing countries whilst sticking to that sort of Paris balance. So those are the challenges we had coming in. And then if I could just go on to the substance, next slide, please. So coming out, we actually had a much longer list of elements than the 5 that we had in strategies and approaches. They're pretty extensive. As Vicky said, if you're a geek for these things, you can look them up in the decision, or if you've got excellent eyesight, you can read them on the screen. But I've sort of sorted them into 5 broad thematic areas. One speaks, that's A and F, speak to sort of levels of finance. How much finance are you going to be providing, where you have it? If not, can you tell us something about what you might know at this point? One, and this is quite new, there's a separate category for programming. I'll get to that in the improvements over the previous system. Then there's a series of information on sort of what providers of support are doing or looking for in terms of their policies and priorities, which is obviously, hopefully, helpful information for developing countries to have. There's some information on internal processes. Some of that relates to, you know, how you approach programming. Some of it refers to why, for instance, you might only be able to provide a certain amount of information at a given point in time. And then the final thematic area I've sort of labeled transformational change, and I just mean that's sort of around achieving the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement or integrating climate into sort of broader development support and capacity building and things that are designed to have a lasting change. And then there was sort of the original retention of qualifiers. All of the information types are pretty clear that they refer to both quantitative and qualitative information to be provided as available. So in some instances, countries will have lots of quantified information at a certain point in time. Other times they won't. That doesn't mean they provide no information, but they provide qualitative information instead. So those are the sort of key areas. But, you know, obviously devil's in the detail and it's in the decision text. So that's the substance. And if we could go over to the next slide, another key question coming in was, when we submit this information, where does it go? How does it get scrutinized? How do we know that you do what you said you were going to do? And obviously that was one of those areas that's quite delicate and sensitive with the balance track in Paris and these limitations that I talked about at the start. But we do have a process. It's quite a long one, and that's why I sort of sketched out this diagram rather than just talking through it. But it essentially begins with a submission. Information will be made available online. That will then be synthesized. That synthesis goes into the global stock take, but there's also then an in-session workshop on the submissions where people can talk about them. Summary report of that is then considered by the CMA. A lot of this then goes into a ministerial dialogue, and that was something that was quite new in Katowice, a sort of suggestion that there will be, well, a decision that there will be a continuation of ministerial dialogues post-2020, and then that dialogue will be summarized and considered by the COP. All of that takes about 2 years, which means you'll actually have the second submissions before you finish the process for the first submission. So, you know, there's a bit of a declining value to each of those individual steps, but of course it's important for many countries to be able to consider and talk about this, and I think this shows that we certainly will be. And then first submission 2020, that was agreed in Katowice. Developed countries will be required to communicate this as a legal obligation. Others are encouraged to. If developed countries don't, that triggers the Article 15 committee, and we'll be having a review of information types in 2023. So there's a whole lot more there than what we were expecting going into Katowice. But you know, for me, it's not the most streamlined process, but it's fine. It gives us space to talk about these things, and in general, we think dialogue is good. So if we can go across to the final slide. So I just wanted to summarize where the Katowice outcome improves on what came before. First is simply there are more specifics, so that will improve the level of detail. I think you can sort of see that just from comparing the old information requirements to the new ones. I won't go into any detail. The second is there's a sort of better separation of elements, and by that I mean the previous process had a lot of overlapping elements, and it was sometimes quite difficult to know where to put different types of information. So there was in one box you had to talk about policies and programs and priorities, and the next category of information you needed to talk about private finance. And there was a lot, well, what if we've got a program that is prioritizing the mobilization of private finance, and that's also one of our policies? Where does that go? So I think the separation helps that out. And in particular, having programs as a standalone information element, I think, is a really big step forward. There's also information that's more useful for programmers. I think this process creates more of a dialogue between developed countries, other parties providing support, and recipients of support, in that we will be explaining, here is what we are trying to do, here are our internal processes, where we don't know things, we have to explain why, and that's that sort of one underneath the improved visibility on limitations. I think that can only be good for trust building, and I hope that when we move forward with the sort of agenda for the ministerial dialogue, that we do approach it with that trust of building a dialogue to help enable all of us to sort of better reach the goals of the agreement. There are also, it's more expansive, as Vicky said earlier, the same as 9.7. Other parties providing support are encouraged to. More information is good for everyone. And there's increased consideration and scrutiny. Like I said, potentially more than we bargained for, but consideration and scrutiny of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. And then on the I think there are some pitfalls to the outcome as well. The one is that, because it needs to be a flexible system, the quality may still vary between parties. There's nothing we can do about that, unfortunately, but it is something to be aware of. Process a bit chunky. I've already talked about that. There are still some, there's still some information duplication between different elements if you run through it. And finally, the provision of information. There are certain elements that will just be challenging if you look at the sort of detail on programs that's requested of countries for the reasons I set out at the start. Sometimes we just don't know that in advance, so it might be very challenging for us to provide information on those elements. Yeah, I'll conclude there because I know that we're eager to get to questions, and I think I'm just a minute or two over. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob, and thank you again, Lorena and Vicky. Really excellent, informative presentations. So we're now going to open the floor to for a question and answer session. And so we already have 3 Q&As. And you should be on your screen now. You should see the instructions for where to submit the Q&As. It's right in the middle of at the bottom of the screen. If you click that box, and then you can type them in. But we'll take the 3 that we have already, and maybe I'll group these 3 together, and then we can do another round later. So first of all, from Sabine. We have a question that I think is for all 3 panelists, is seeking to confirm whether the new provisions decided at the Katowice COP on the 3 topics are all should provisions and thus voluntary, or are they binding for developed countries? And then from Ilari, a question for Vicky, what existing practice do developed countries have in reporting support provided, so finance, tech, and capacity building, with the use of common tabular formats, and through which instruments, such as national communications and biennial reports? And then from Jörg, how would you judge the reporting provision on additionality? Does that ensure that industrialized country parties will actually need to mobilize new and additional finance as compared to diverting existing development aid? So we'll go through, maybe we can start with Vicky, because she had that specific one on existing practice in reporting on support, and then throw it out to Lorena and Rob as well on the other 2 questions.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll tackle the one from Ilari first, but I will also respond to the one from Sabine, because I think that's, yeah, for all 3 of us. Which existing practices that we have? I mean, under the current system, we have CTF tables, which includes tables on finance support provided through bilateral channels, through multilateral channels, and also on technology and capacity building. We don't have, under the UNFCCC, a table on support mobilized through public intervention, so that will be a new one if we develop one during this year. But we do have a lot of existing practice. It's now more about making sure that we actually take on board the new elements or the new provisions of the current, of the new system into the tables. And this will be done through, the most recent one you can actually find on the biennial reports. Again, if you are a geek, this will be done. This is to be found on the 9 CP21. There you have the tables, the current tables, which we use for the biennial reports. So that's on that question, if that will be all. And then on the first one, you're taking them away. On what we have on the should and the shall provision. So on support provided and mobilized, it's actually a shall provision for developed country parties. Because under the current system, it's also a shall. So we have to report, we have to use the MPGs, and we have to use the tables that will be developed to report or on support provided and mobilized. But like I've mentioned, there are different caveats. So it doesn't include that if some information is not applicable to you as a party because, for instance, you do not give guarantees, of course, you do not need to report on guarantees. So there are some distinctions to take on board. For other parties providing support, so other parties than developed country parties, they are encouraged to use the MPGs, and they have a should provision on providing the information. So it's, I hope, I mean, that's it in a nutshell for provided and mobilized. So yeah, that's all for me.
Great, thank you, Vicky. And Lorena, the questions I moved to answered actually, but they're still available to view there.
Thank you, Joe. I'll answer the first question that was addressed to all of us, and then I'll try to briefly touch upon another question that is addressed to me that I see on the screen, if that's all right for you.
Sure. Yeah.
So in terms of the bindingness or the voluntary provisions for the reporting of finance received and needed, in the case of the provisions under Article 13 for developing countries to report on this, these are voluntary reportings that will be done. These are should provisions as contained in the Paris Agreement and then operationalized in the Katowice climate package. So over time, we would expect that more and more developing countries see the benefits in establishing the systems to collect, gather, and process, analyze all of the information required to actually know how much climate finance they're getting, and then be able to compare this information with the broader landscape under the UNFCCC. More relevantly, in the context of COP24 and since a couple of years, there has been a very important undergoing conversation in terms of how do we determine the needs and how do we strengthen the capacities of developing countries to identify the needs in terms of not only the financial resources that they're going to need to implement these climate actions, but also in terms of technology that they will require, and very, very important, the capacity needs and the capacity gaps that they already have, so that they can strengthen and improve over time as well. So in terms of the enhanced transparency framework, we could expect that more countries use these MPGs, use these guidelines in terms of preparing for what's going to be happening from 2020 onwards, and specifically in terms of the determination of needs. I think the mindset has been changing recently. More directly, once the developing countries undertook the process of preparing and submitting their intended nationally determined contributions, and now their national determined contributions as confirmed once they ratify the Paris Agreement. In doing so, many developing countries have started to think of all the elements that they will require in order to actually fulfill their contributions and to move a step forward in line with what science is requiring. So the identification of needs and the communication of these needs to the UNFCCC will change, I think, in the next couple of years very quickly, and will provide more information to actually feed back into the system and bring some of the lessons learned for others to also improve and build capacity over time.
Great, thank you, Lorena. And so there are a few more questions. I'll see if Rob wants to grapple with any of them, but then I see some more that are directed at Vicky and 9.7 related issues a little bit more. So I would perhaps group Jörg and Fiona's questions on which both relate to additionality or new and additional in 9.7 to pass that back to Vicky. But Rob, I wondered if you had any comments on the Sabine's overarching question as well about the should, shall type provisions.
Yeah, I'll be brief. 9.5 is a shall provision for developed countries, so the actual submission is legally binding. If you don't, that triggers the compliance committee under the Paris Agreement. What you put in there is sort of has those as available as applicable provisions, but we hope that where countries have information, they do provide it. And the insertion of one of the elements that refers to other limitations to information provision, that's quite intentional, and that means that if countries aren't explaining why they're not providing more information, you can read into that what you will, and then it's an encouragement for other parties providing support, and we hope they do provide information.
Great, and I've just seen actually Vicky responded to Kiri's very detailed question on 9.7 and OECD, but Vicky, I wondered if you had any thoughts on the additionality questions that Jörg and Fiona posed.
Yeah. Yes, of course I do. First, maybe just to indicate what is included in the modalities is that parties need to report on how they identify or how an indication of what new and additional financial resources have been provided and how it has been determined that such resources are new and additional. So I haven't mentioned this during my presentation. I mean, it's difficult to choose, but it's still there that we need to report on new and additional financial resources and how we have determined such resources are new and additional. Now, I mean, I just want to clarify that to me, this does not mean new and additional compared to the ODA. I am aware that we are talking, I mean, official development aid has its own definition on what it is, and many of the climate finance can be reported as ODA. That doesn't take away our commitment towards the 0.7%, but I do want to say that it's not because it's ODA that it can't be climate finance. I know this is a political discussion that we're having over and over again, and even during the negotiations at Katowice, it has been an issue, of course, but I mean, at least we're not backtracking anything. We are doing this same reporting, saying what we consider to be new and additional, but we still don't come to political decision on what it is, which makes it very difficult for reporters then to say how to report on it. But yeah, this could be, I can talk a whole hour about this, so feel free to, talk to me personally.
Great. Well, maybe we can have another webinar. We can have a new and additional webinar at some point in the future. But I see we're almost out of time. So I'd like to thank the panelists and all the participants for joining us today. If you've enjoyed today's webinar, I encourage you to visit our website to find out more about upcoming webinars and to view past recordings. The next webinar will take place on Thursday, March the 14th at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time in the US and Canada. And it will focus on climate data for action, the country platforms for India and Indonesia. This is related to the Climate Watch online platform, which is designed to empower policymakers, researchers, and other stakeholders around the world with climate data, visualizations, and resources that they need to gather insights on national and global process on climate change. This spring, WRI is going to be expanding Climate Watch with 2 online data platforms for India and Indonesia. So if you join us next week, you'll be able to learn about these new country platforms. But thank you all again for joining us and have a very good day. The webinar is now concluded.